if we're diagnosed with a comorbidity, then we can still undertake resistance training to improve our quality of life of living with those comorbidities. That really speaks volumes about the importance of physical activity as a whole, but specifically resistance training and strength training.
Welcome to the Strength Changes Everything podcast, where we introduce you to the information, latest research, and tools that will enable you to live a strong, healthy life. On this podcast, we will also answer your questions about strength, health, and well-being. I'm Amy Hudson. I own and operate 3 exercise coach studios. My co-hosts are Brian Sagan, co-founder and CEO of The Exercise Coach, and Dr. James Fisher, leading researcher in evidence-based strength training. And now for today's episode. Welcome back to the podcast. Today's episode is a research review with Dr. Fisher. We have a new paper that it's just come out in 2025 entitled Global Consensus on Optimal Exercise Recommendations for Enhancing Healthy Longevity in Older Adults. So, Dr. Fisher, this sounds like a pretty comprehensive paper that's come out, and any global consensus on anything is pretty rare, right? And so I'm very interested for you to go through this with us today. And I know you've come prepared to walk us through this entire thing. How are you doing today, first of all?
I'm doing great. Thank you, Amy. Yeah, I'm doing great. And I'm really excited to discuss this paper. I think it's, as you said, it's 2025. It's brand new, and it'll be a great one to kind of talk through and to give this information to the listeners, to the people that need it most, really. So it's a great opportunity.
Yes, let's walk us through this paper.
Okay, so first of all, it's worth just clarifying. The idea of a global consensus sounds a bit hyperbolic in nature, but actually, when we look at the list of authors, and if you ever look at the paper and see the list of references, this truly is, a consensus by some of the greatest academics in the field. Michaelis Chiado is the first author and the corresponding author, but some of the other notables on there that I know, Therese Salou-Ambrose, Paul Cohen, and people like that. So it really is kind of a who's who of exercise science, whether it's strength training, aerobic training, high intensity interval training, and so forth. And of course, linking to medical conditions and not just longevity. The title is Longevity in Older Adults, but I think it's also important to point out this is not just about adding years to life. It's about improving quality of life as we age, and it's about being able to kind of wade off medical conditions as well. And the paper is an extensive research paper that talks through a number of different exercise modalities. Primarily, we'll talk about just a few of those today, and the main one we'll discuss is resistance training, partly because I think that has considerable emphasis. Obviously, on this podcast, with Strength Changes Everything, but also as we go through the paper, you'll see that resistance training is probably the single most important modality that's discussed in this paper. We'll jump in. I've got some slides here as well I'm going to work through as well. So if you're listening on the podcast, then consider going to the YouTube channel where you'll see the images as well. And I'll do my best to talk through the images as we go through them. But obviously, it won't quite do the justice to the pictures themselves. So really what this paper does is it introduces the idea that exercise is the single most important, they call it PA throughout the paper, so physical activity or exercise is the single most important thing we can do for our quality of life and our longevity as human beings. And we often talk about the idea from an evolutionary perspective that we're built to move, we're designed to move, we're not designed with the same kind of evolution that we've seen, especially in Western society, where we might spend a lot of time in a seated position. We might consume a surplus of calories because of their availability and so forth. So we have a lot of muscle wastage in sarcopenia. We have a lot of bone loss because of a lack of exercise, and osteopenia, and we have a lot of strength loss in dynapenia as well. But they can also lead to a lot of other medical conditions, and we'll talk about some of those as we go through it. Now, the image that I've shown on the screen, just to talk through this briefly, is this idea that we can change our exercise habits, or our exercise habits maybe should change throughout our lifespan. And in our younger age, the implication here is that we can do more aerobic and cardiovascular-based exercise. Now, I find that quite interesting. They haven't highlighted strength training there because there's more and more research to say that strength training is beneficial in young people and in children, even to the extent of improving kind of academic grades and exam grades and so forth, as well as self-esteem and physical self-worth. And we all know the issues of mental health in young people right now. But they may have looked for a certain quality of research or a certain amount of research to provide recommendations. So in the early years, they've sort of omitted resistance training there. But then as we get to kind of middle age, they've moved forward and they've said that progressive resistance training, so on the graph it's labeled as PRT, that's progressive resistance training. They've highlighted the importance of it there. And then again, in our later years, they highlight progressive resistance training, balance, and gait. So gait is our kind of walking ability, whether it's a product of our flexibility, mobility, stability, and so forth. And of course, our balance, as we say. So, and of course, on this podcast, we talk about strength changes everything. And that's exactly what this figure is saying, that through age, through our normal aging process, there's an importance of adding progressive resistance training to maintain quality of life and function and so forth, and ward off comorbidities and ill health.
I'll point something out too at the bottom of this image. I mean, the vertical axis is age, and then it shows the different optimal exercise prescriptions as one gets older. At the bottom, the horizontal axis, the words frailty, sarcopenia, and comorbidities is there, and so it makes sense. Or is this true that because frailty, sarcopenia, and comorbidities become more of a concern as we age, this is where the resistance training becomes that much more important?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And it might even be that when you're younger, you can get away without resistance training because of your hormonal balance and because of your exercise and because of your kind of anabolic status of your body. We're kind of in a building phase when we're in our youth, but we're very much in a breaking down phase as we age. We've obviously had Wayne Westcott on the podcast, and we've talked about sort of muscle loss and bone loss as we age. So yeah, you're absolutely right. Frailty is frailty to me is such a damning word. It's this
Mhm.
idea that when we reach a certain age, to me, it embodies this idea of that our skeletal system and our muscular system isn't really able to support our body weight anymore. We need to maybe walk with a stick or a walker, or we can't rise from a chair, or we can't perform these these daily functions. Um, and of course, that's absolutely true for many people. And this paper is saying that if we begin resistance training in kind of our middle ages, if not before, we build up what we've talked about before as our strength span, kind of an insurance policy of muscular strength and bone mineral density, so that as we age, we can combat these comorbidities, this sarcopenia and this dynapenia and so forth. So yeah, that's a great point, Amy. Okay, so the next image that we've shown there details a number of different sort of comorbidities as we go around. It's in a sort of circular format, and we can see arthritis, cancer, chronic obstructive pulmonary diseases. We see renal failure, we see congestive heart failure, coronary artery disease, dementia, depression, osteoporosis, peripheral vascular disease, stroke, type 2 diabetes, and so forth. So we see a number of medical conditions that are all really commonplace in Western society. I'm sure based on that list, we can all think of somebody in our day-to-day life who has one of those conditions, if not multiple people or multiple conditions that we're aware of. There's probably none of those conditions that we are not aware of, at least in a second-hand basis from somebody that we know. And that really speaks of the prevalence of those medical conditions or those comorbidities. Um, what's really interesting is this paper is talking about the idea of physical exercise being able to, first of all, combat the occurrence of this ill health, these comorbidities themselves, but then also to be able to improve the quality of life of people maybe living with these conditions. So, for example, if we talk about something like cancer or chronic renal failure, then we know that strength training can help improve the quality of life and can work with medication to improve muscle mass and improve bone mass and improve function of living with such medical conditions. So it's not just about resistance training early enough to combat these comorbidities. It's if we're diagnosed with a comorbidity, then we can still undertake resistance training to improve our quality of life of living with those comorbidities. And I think that really speaks volumes about the importance of physical activity as a whole, but specifically resistance training and strength training.
Yes, I think about going to the doctor, and at the doctor's office, when you're going for a yearly physical, there's a long, long checklist of family history that you have to check off. And, maybe there's 50 things on that list, and then you have to say mother, father, maternal grandmother, maternal grandfather. You have to check off who in your family history has dealt with all kinds of these things. And first of all, the quantity of these things, these comorbidities, that there are, and then how many people that you have in your family, is a little bit sobering sometimes, for some of us to fill this out. But that's what I think of, but that is what motivates me personally, um, in having a business that helps people strength train, because of the fact that what you just said is that we can combat, ward off, sometimes, in some cases, reverse some of these, through strength training, or improve our quality of life if we do have these, or develop any of these conditions. And to me, there's just no greater gift somebody can give themselves than strength in both of those respects, combating and living with. And so it is sobering that we have to face this, but the good news is that strength training can drastically reduce our risk or help us handle as we do get older.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So as the paper continues, and I have the paper right in front of me, so I'm going to read some direct quotes from the paper as we go. The paper actually gives table one is exercise recommendations for optimal aging. I love that phrase, optimal aging, the ideal way that we want to get older. Healthy aging, or maintaining our health, or even maintain biological age younger than our chronological age. Is something that we often say for optimal aging and maintenance or improvement of functional capacity in older adults. And they talk about one of the columns is resistance training, and they then give guidelines or recommendations around resistance training. And I just want to speak about a few of these because they're linked so closely, obviously, to what we do with the exercise coach. So the frequency is 2 to 3 days per week. And obviously, the exercise coach promotes 2 20-minute workouts per week. The volume is 1 to 3 sets of exercise for major muscle groups. The exercise examples are multiple and single joint exercises with slow to moderate lifting velocity. Um, they talk about monitoring techniques and form, and their quote is, utilize a qualified trainer to ensure exercises are performed correctly, reducing the risk of strain or injury. To go on to say, control velocity and range of motion, avoid sudden jerky movements, maintain a controlled pace. And I know obviously these link so closely, or in fact, they're already a part of the philosophy of strength training at the exercise coach. Obviously, they're supervised workouts, 2 20-minute workouts per week. It's a controlled range of motion. It's a controlled movement velocity, and so forth. So, we often talk about the fact that the exercise coach use an evidence-based approach to strength training. And I wanted to highlight this because this is the paper that's the evidence base around how to engage in resistance training to combat these comorbidities. And as it says, for optimal aging. And I think it's really noteworthy that many of the recommendations are exactly the protocol used by the exercise coach and the coaches.
Yes, absolutely. If you're a client at a studio, you should just be patting yourself on the back right now for being a client and participating in the exact recommendations that many experts around the world have recommended for optimal aging.
Okay, so moving on, we've talked about a number of medical conditions on the previous slide, but I actually, in going through the paper, detailed every medical condition that they talk about, and I've listed them up on the screen here. And these are medical conditions that they say are positively impacted by resistance training. I'll read them out for those people listening on a podcast. And my apologies if my voice gets a bit boring in this, because this is a list and it's an extensive list. So they talk about resistance training positively impacting the following: depression and anxiety, hypertension, insomnia, insulin resistance, systemic inflammation, arthritis, atherosclerosis, cancer, congestive heart failure, cognitive impairment or dementia, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease or asthma, osteoporosis, Parkinson's disease, peripheral neuropathy, peripheral vascular disease, renal failure, stroke, a decline in aerobic capacity, osteopenia or osteoporosis, and sarcopenia. Now, when I look at that list, there are some of those conditions that we often think about, and we maybe don't make a connection to exercise or even lifestyle habits. We might look at Parkinson's disease and think that that's to some extent, just a genetic kind of predisposition, that we might be prone to Parkinson's disease, or we might be prone to renal failure, or or any of those other kind of medical conditions. But actually, the idea that resistance training can, in fact, to some extent, prevent those conditions or delay those conditions, or improve those conditions if we still suffer them. One of them that's not mentioned, but it falls under cognitive impairment, is Alzheimer's. And that's another one. We've talked about mental health and brain health in a previous episode, Amy. And I know that this is such a big issue now because we're physically living longer. It's perhaps our brain that's failing us, and it's a horrible thing to see maybe our parents or family members suffer with cognitive memory loss or cognitive impairment, dementia, and things like that. So the idea that engagement in resistance training might be able to ward off these morbidities is really important, in my opinion.
Absolutely. Yes, I could not agree more.
So, and then as we go through the paper, to a really nice quote here, and of course, when we say it, it makes perfect sense. I'm going to read the section that precedes this, and then I've highlighted the main quote onto the screen for those people watching on YouTube. But the full quote itself reads: "The modality of physical activity performed is also critical for intended health outcomes beyond mortality, as many exercise adaptations are modality specific. For example, anabolic exercises, such as progressive resistance training, are vital for maintaining or enhancing functional capacity in older adults, particularly those who are frail or with conditions such as sarcopenia and osteoporosis, mobility impairment, or those hospitalized or in residential care." I'll pause for a second and just highlight that if somebody is in that later stage of life where they're in a care home or residential care, where they're hospitalized, the idea that they can still engage in muscle strengthening activity is really important. These people are not put out to pasture. Their muscles are still capable of contracting. When we think of progressive resistance training, especially young males who may be listening might be having the question, well, how much can you bench? That's the old adage of strength training, but that's not what strength training is. Strength training is simply the contraction of a muscle against a resistance, whatever that resistance might be. And we've highlighted here the health benefits attached to that. So just because somebody is in a hospitalized or residential care situation doesn't mean they can't engage in this kind of resistance training. This importance is underscored by the rapid loss of muscle mass that older adults experience during hospitalization or periods of illness, leading to weakened muscle strength, power, and function, which in turn increases the risk of falls, disability, morbidity, and mortality. And then I've highlighted the next section on the screen because while it sounds like the most obvious thing to say, I think it really hits home. And the quote is: "No medications currently enhance fitness, functional capacity, or alleviate frailty. Thus, physical exercise remains the most effective therapeutic intervention for disease prevention and management, as well as maintaining functional abilities." Now, we've probably all heard the joke that if exercise came in a pill, everybody would take it. And I'm sure they would. But the reality is that this statement is saying that we can't take medication to improve those things. We can't take medication to improve our quality of life above a baseline. If we engage in physical exercise and specifically resistance training, we improve our baseline. So should we then fall subject to a medical condition or a comorbidity, then we of course start from a higher point, a higher strength, a higher functionality, a lesser degree of disability, a lesser risk of falls, and so forth. So that decline would hopefully be slower, but we'd be starting from a higher point anyway. We could also see there, as well as the World Health Organization advocates a healthy diet, regular exercise, um, moderate alcohol consumption, and so on and so forth. But what I wanted to highlight there is the World Health Organization. So when we talk about a global consensus, this quite literally is a global consensus. I've worked in the UK with the CMO, that's the Chief Medical Officer, and in the most recent exercise recommendations, we placed resistance training ahead of cardiovascular training in the physical activity recommendations. And this paper actually is going one further and citing the World Health Organization as far as regular physical activity and resistance training recommendations.
Wow. I've got a question for you. So I've heard Dr. Casey Means, who's pretty prolific out there, and she talks about creating health. And so there's preventing or fixing diseases, which we typically rely on medications for. And then there's creating health in the body. And so, this quote that we highlighted here: no medications currently enhance fitness, functional capacity, or alleviate frailty. Thus, physical exercise remains the most effective therapeutic intervention for disease prevention and management, as well as maintaining functional abilities. Would it be fair to call exercise a sort of a proactive measurement that we could, or intervention for our health, to create health proactively versus reactively treat a disease?
Oh my goodness! I mean, what a wonderful statement. We often think that by the time we walk into a doctor's office and we've got this medical condition, we're already starting from behind the start line. We're already having to take something just to get us back to a neutral kind of baseline level. But the idea that we can proactively, as you say, treat any potential medical conditions and improve our quality of life ahead of time, what a wonderful way to phrase that. I also think that there's many people who might be suffering with different conditions and not even be aware of those conditions. When we talk about the list of medical conditions on the previous slide, one of them was depression and anxiety. And many people suffer with these sorts of conditions without even realizing. We talk about cognitive impairment. Well, these exist on a spectrum. They're on a sliding scale. So it might be that somebody isn't suffering from cognitive impairment, but somebody can improve their cognitive function. It might be that somebody isn't suffering from anxiety, but they can improve their confidence and their self-esteem beyond their current level. It might be that somebody isn't suffering from, as we say, sort of depression or other psychological or physical conditions. Some people wake up fatigued, some people wake up with headaches, some people find that they're distracted from work, they might suffer from insomnia or poor sleep habits, and they might not attribute it to anything. They might not think it's serious enough to seek pharmaceutical intervention or to go and see a doctor or a GP. But actually, engagement in physical exercise creates, well, first of all, it creates good, healthy habits. So those people who engage in physical exercise and strength training as a whole probably then engage in other healthy habits as well, whether that's going to sleep at a good time, whether that's nutrition and so forth. But the idea that they've done this kind of exercise, whole body exercise, they might feel fatigued, therefore they might go to bed earlier, therefore they might wake up more refreshed because they slept through the night, and so forth. So they're certainly, like we've sort of said, improving their baseline, even though there may not be a medical condition that's sort of diagnosed or having pharmaceutical remedy.
Yeah, one visual that I've come across before to picture this, what you're saying. If you picture a continuum and disease is on one side of the continuum, um, kind of like maintaining the status quo would be in the middle of the continuum, and then thriving, healthy is on the other side of the continuum. Just because you're in the middle of the continuum where you're not actively having a disease that you're having to treat or you're aware of it, does not mean you're getting healthier or does not mean you're thriving. Being in the middle will actually lead you to to the end of the continuum if you don't do anything proactive, just because of age, of time, of how we know sarcopenia happens or anything else, right? With aging, we're not going to get healthier without doing anything. And so just because I'm not actively sick, does that mean I am thriving? Right. And so that's a helpful way to look at this and for people to be honest with where they're at on this spectrum. And you can always slide up.
Yeah, I love that analogy, and I wonder if we could extend that to say that this line that exists where thrive is on the one end and ill health is on the other end, um, actually starts to tilt as we age. So we're more likely to take this
Mm,
slide down into ill health, but we can move ourselves up into the thrive status, and therefore, as we slide with age, we slide slower because we're combating it, but we also have a lot further to slide before we reach ill health. So yeah, that's a great example, Amy. Thank you. Moving on briefly, there's a couple of pages here, and I'm going to zoom in on these as well. But this is a table of some of the medical conditions, and what I've highlighted on the screen here is the exercise recommendations are on the right hand side, and what I've highlighted is where it says resistance training. And in fact, if you're not watching on YouTube, if you're listening on the podcast, then the footnotes for this is that every medical condition listed has resistance training as a recommended exercise modality. If I go into them, we can see arthritis, cancer, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, and so forth, coronary artery disease, dementia. All of them have resistance training as a recommended exercise modality to combat and to treat these conditions: depression, osteoporosis, as we said, stroke, type 2 diabetes, and so forth. Now, it's also worth highlighting, and we'll start to move on to other modalities here as well, because I realize while the emphasis of this podcast is strength changes everything, I think it's important to recognize there are other modalities of exercise. The paper does talk about aerobic training. It talks about gait training. It talks about high intensity interval training, and it talks about balance training as well, specifically as we age. And they're, of course, all things that people can engage in to improve their functional performance and their quality of life with age. But perhaps one of the reasons that it's so important to mention those things is, again, linking back to the exercise coach and the evidence-based recommendations, is that the exercise coach do promote high intensity interval training in the form of concentrated cardio. Um, they do have a program which is in the process of being refined right now, which is going to be a 6 month balance transformation, which has a balance training and a balance and cognitive training component to it. They do have flexibility training and coach assisted stretching as well. So the exercise coach can really be kind of a one stop shop to all of these exercise modalities that are discussed within this global consensus on physical activity recommendations.
mhm. Yep, it's the easiest thing you can do to follow the protocols that the experts recommend, right? Is to sign up at an exercise coach.
Right, absolutely. Now, I'm going to jump right to the conclusion here as well. So this is the final paragraph of the entire research paper. And again, for those listening on YouTube, I've shown this on the screen. If you're listening on the podcast, then I'll read this out to you. But it simply says, promoting physical activity in adults is a multifaceted societal issue that involves not only geriatricians, but also family doctors, health fitness trainers and physiotherapists, policymakers, health agencies, insurance companies, and urban planners. But the effective promotion of physical activity requires a collaborative approach and the development of environments and policies that encourage active lifestyles among older adults. Thus, this consensus calls for evidence-based exercise programs tailored to the needs and capabilities of older adults, ensuring that these programs are comprehensive and adaptable to individual health conditions. The ultimate goal is enhanced quality of life, regardless of age or initial state of fitness or frailty. Now, first of all, this is a wonderful way to summarize the paper as a whole, but there are a few key things within this. And the first of all is that it talks about this as being a societal issue. Now, in the UK, we have the National Health Service. So we have, public healthcare. So everybody here pays for healthcare before they need it. So the idea that everybody can manage their health by exercise intervention, whether it's resistance training or other modalities that we've talked about, before they need it can effectively ease the burden on the National Health Service. But we also know that people being off work sick, or even people attending work sick and being having a lesser function or a lesser performance can contribute to costing economies billions and billions of pounds. We talk about absenteeism where people are off sick, costing money, but there's also presenteeism where people are turning in because they need to get paid to be there, but they're not functioning very well because they're unwell. So this really is a whole societal issue. And it's really important to me. This talks about family doctors. When we think about medical professionals like family doctors, we often think about pharmaceutical intervention, and of course that might be a line of treatment that these professionals use in the healthcare alliance. These professionals use to look at these comorbidities, and I'm not for a second suggesting that pharmaceutical intervention isn't important or in some cases essential. But we should also be aware that the doctors are not exercise professionals. It's not their responsibility to be exercise professionals. And of course, in this statement, it highlights health and fitness trainers, physiotherapists, health agencies. And so we see organizations like the exercise coach who really should have a greater emphasis in society, because they're the people that are effectively treating this ill health before it occurs with many of their clients, or treating this ill health as it's occurring with many of their clients. To combat this poor health, this frailty, this sarcopenia and dynapenia and osteopenia in society, these societal issues as a whole. The conclusion goes on, but the idea that it talks about evidence-based exercise programs tailors the needs and capabilities of older adults. And again, I think this speaks volumes about what the exercise coach does. We obviously on this podcast review a number of research papers, and we know that the coaches use this research. I for one have written I've co-authored the Strength Changes Everything white paper, which is the scientific underpinning of the exercise coach strength training philosophy. And there are multiple other scientific papers that I've co-authored within the exercise coach that talk about the different modalities of exercise. So the idea that the exercise coach are using these evidence-based programs is key. And the idea that these are suitable for all adults, older adults, younger adults, those with ill health and those without, I think is really something worth sort of flagging up.
How we hope to help people within our studios, first to engage in the physical activity that we know can sometimes save their life or restore health, particularly strength training, physical activity. But also the point is, we also want to make it non-intimidating, non-complicated, safe, effective, and efficient for people to engage. I know oftentimes barriers exist for people to think about participating in the resistance training that may drastically improve their quality of life because it could be intimidating. They may feel like it's too time consuming. They may have a fear of getting hurt. They may dislike it. And so that's where we want to make it easy. We want to make it convenient. We want to make it safe, effective, and super efficient for people, as many people as possible, to benefit from the amazing, life-changing value that strength training provides. And so that is what our passion is, our mission is.
Fantastic. Yeah. So there we go. So that's the research paper, and it's another sort of research review that we've done, but I think it highlights some really important information. And we've previously answered some questions on this podcast relating to poor health and relating to different topics. And we now have the link open on our Strength Changes Everything website, don't we, Amy, where people can ask a question or suggest the topic.
Yep. If you have a question that you'd like us to cover on this podcast, go to strengthchangeseverything.com. Right at the top of the page, there's an orange button that says submit a topic. You can suggest a topic for us to cover on the podcast or submit a question you have for us. And we will, on a future Q&A episode, try to answer as many as we can. We would love to hear from you. So please go to strengthchangeseverything.com and tell us what you have to say. Well, we will see you next time on the podcast. Hope you remember, strength changes everything. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed today's episode, please share it with a friend. You can submit a question or connect with the show at strengthchangeseverything.com. Join us next week for another episode, and be sure to follow the show on Apple Podcasts, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts so that you never miss another episode. Here's to you and your best health.